there's lots of myths and misconceptions of what people have heard of going and setting up in the US, and it is just, echoing what Nick said, so much more complicated because you're overlaid with 50 different countries, essentially.
So one of the things I think businesses specifically need to think about, and they don't always actually, is what business model they're actually going to operate when they go into that.
Right. They understand how complex their home jurisdiction is, which informs how they take advice. Whereas we don't necessarily have that degree of complexity in the UK around some of the corporate setup and the tax challenges that are multifaceted across the US.
There's no point thinking you've got a super successful operation overseas only to realise that it's supported heavily from the UK, and actually if it was standing on its own right, it would not be making the level of profit it is.
The labour laws that we have enshrined in our legislation and the protections for employees are, wildly different to the US.
If you haven't locked down the ownership of the IP, you haven't defined who's doing what for who, if it's all just treated as one across your group, then you are likely to have issues down the line.
Doing business in London compared to Leeds or Manchester feels different culturally, but it's the same sort of business. That's the difference in the US. It's governed by, different state laws and practices.
Hello and welcome to our Business But Better podcast, brought to you by Irwin Mitchell. I'm Richard Baigent, an international trade consultant with Irwin Mitchell, and I'll be your host for this series. For anyone joining us for the first time, welcome. This podcast is designed to bring you stories and advice from across the industry, helping you navigate the challenges and opportunities your business faces. In this series, we're discussing FDI, that's foreign direct investment, and what makes the UK such an attractive destination for overseas investors. In our previous episodes, we talked about how to do business in the UK, the benefits that free ports and investment zones can offer anyone looking to invest in the UK. And in this episode, the final of the season, we'll be thinking about growing international investment, focusing particularly on the US as an example, it being our biggest trading partner as a country. To do so, I'm delighted to be joined by two experts who explain what business between the UK and the US is really like and what support is on offer for anyone interested in exploring the US opportunity further. Firstly, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Georgie Collins, Head of Intellectual Property at Irwin Mitchell and Head of their US desk. Georgie spent much of her career working with US-based businesses and individuals. She provides support to help UK businesses expand and succeed in the US, and also helps US companies set up and invest in the UK. I'd also like to welcome Nick Farmer, partner at Menzies. Nick specialises in providing international tax advice to businesses both in the UK and overseas. With deep experience for the US market in particular, he works with organisations to manage risk when expanding to new markets and structure global transactions. Welcome both. With a shared history and strong cultural ties, the opportunities for collaboration between American and British businesses cannot be overstated. I'm going to talk to a few stats here. The US is the largest trading partner for the UK, with circa 18% of total trade. That's compared with 46.5% with the EU as a whole. And that comes from the Office of National Statistics in June 24. The US is the largest inward FDI partner for the UK, with circa 34% of the UK's inward investment coming from the US. And that goes against the EU as a whole at 29%. So you can see the US and the UK have an extremely important trading relationship. So Nick, clearly the opportunity between the UK and the US is huge. What areas should be considered to make a venture into the US or foreign direct investment into the UK a success?
Firstly, thank you for that introduction, because I think it sets the scene superbly. I mean, the US is by far, sort of as a single country, our number one trading partner. We certainly see more inbound and outbound investment going to the US than any other particular country. So it is one which actually through time you start to understand the intricacies of. There are definitely sort of business channel specialist sort of knowledge that people need in order to sort of navigate that landscape well. So if you look at outbound investment from the UK into the US, firstly, you're going into a market which is, significantly larger than the UK. It's separated into 50 different states. So that's your first challenge. When we look at it from a tax point of view, there's so many different layers of tax, whether they be federal, state, local taxes. It's a very different landscape from the UK. And I think that's one of the things that UK businesses really need to understand, that trading into any market, and certainly trading into a market like the US that is separated in that manner, is very different, and they need to sort of get an awareness of what that will mean before they go to that market. So I can give you some sort of examples of the things that I think people need to think about. Firstly, if you're going into the US, there's a number of different entities that you might choose to actually establish there. There's not sort of a one-size-fits-all way of actually going into that market. Secondly, the interaction between the UK and the US, there's a lot of differences around, say, the taxes and how they, will interact. Where your profit is actually being made. Is it being made in the UK, and then you're sort of expanding your business into the US, and you're looking to sort of minimize your profit there, or you're actually looking to sort of put down more established trading operations there and actually sort of trade in a more significant way. So one of the things I think businesses specifically need to think about, and they don't always actually, is what business model they're actually going to operate when they go into that new market on the ground. What do they really need to do to be successful in that market?
Yeah. I mean, things like transfer pricing, I'm guessing, become really important.
I mean, we can dive into transfer pricing. It's going to underpin any international trade relationship. I mentioned a little bit earlier about where you're making your profit, and that's exactly what transfer pricing is about. I think some people think transfer pricing is just a tax tool. It certainly isn't. I mean, businesses from a commercial perspective really need to understand how they're making their money globally. There's no point thinking you've got a super successful operation overseas only to realize that it's supported heavily from the UK, and actually if it was standing on its own right, it would not be making the level of profit it is. So therefore, businesses need to look at that interaction between their operations back in the home market and what they put overseas, because both countries' tax authorities are going to want their share of the pie. It's always the case trading internationally. We're seeing a lot of change with the US, new administration coming in, potential changes, certainly with sort of tariffs being very high on the current administration's agenda. So again, understanding the local landscape, how to trade efficiently, how to actually make the profit and repatriate it back to the UK. It's that flow around that perhaps people get attracted to a market because they've traded there from the UK successfully. But as soon as you change the dynamics and you put people on the ground and you start to actually make profit in the market, there's a lot more that people need to think about in terms of how they're sort of dealing with those two different systems and how they interact.
Yeah. Georgie, any observations?
Yes, one main marker, I guess, in terms of where sometimes things can go awry or it doesn't get set up strategically from the beginning, and that is the sort of unintended consequence of setting up in a particular place without necessarily strategic thought around it.
Right.
So, for example, we'll have scenarios where clients will say, we're going to set up a factory in X, we need to be there. And the question is, do you?
Right.
Do you actually need to be there? Do you need to incorporate? Why?
Yeah.
So that's often my first question when a client comes to me and says we're looking to take the business abroad, or actually we're looking to set up in the US, and we want to be here. And I'll say, why is that? And sometimes it's for very good reasons. It's for family reasons. They know the state, they know the city that they want to go to. rational decisions made around that, but often not. And it is the factory's there, or I have a customer base there, and I'll say, but your business is predominantly virtual and digital. So actually,
you don't need to be based next door to them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And then throw into that will be what feeds into, what Nick does. And I'll be like, help Nick, which is, and by the way, we're going to incorporate a company in Delaware or wherever with no, again, thought relative to where they really are going to be based. And do they need to do that? And I think there's lots of myths and misconceptions of what people have heard of going and setting up in the US. And it is just, echoing what Nick said, so much more complicated because you're overlaid with 50 different countries, essentially, and the different nuances and cultures of doing business in many of those states and the practices. And, of course, we have our nuances in our regions in the UK, but it's magnified to, 1,000,000% in the US compared to here.
I think one of the interesting things, isn't it, that both countries, the UK and the US, rank highly on the sort of ease of doing business. Mm-hmm. So the US does tend to score well on ease of doing business, actually sort of setting up operations there. But there is a sort of, as we've been talking about, a much bigger market. It's separated between these states, and you can't sort of just look at it as one country to some extent. You've got to look at it as doing business in those different states and thinking, as you say, that through in advance. Sometimes you get people who say, look, I don't really know where I want to go. Can you advise me?
Yep.
And, that can be done. And, there's a lot of information out there that will rank different states for attractiveness to do business. And they've all got incentives that are available for people to come and set up there. As you say, you've got other people who are, keen that they've got to be on the East Coast or the West Coast, time zones, those can be a challenge. If you go as far as the West Coast, you've got an 8-hour time shift between the UK and the US. So I think on my sort of previous discussion, I talked about what I would call these cage factors. And I think they are things that people have to think about. There's a distance between the UK and the US. So when I'm talking cage, it's the cultural, administrative, geographic, economic factors. And it's breaking those down. And there is, that kind of administrative distance between the UK and the US that people need to just work out how they're going to navigate. I think a lot of people actually probably feel quite comfortable doing business in the US. Language, it suddenly it helps. There's a very established base of professional support available, but you've always got to go in with your eyes open.
Yeah. We get on as well. I mean, I lived and worked in New York for 2 or 3 years in my banking career, and they like us. They like that. They think we're funny. They think we're funny. Humorous, that is.
Even if you're not trying to be.
Exactly. And it goes a long way. There are deep cultural ties there. Georgie, we know that the protection of intellectual property, or IP, is critical for businesses, particularly when expanding overseas. Companies have to get this right and remain compliant, as they must with employment law and data protection, for example. Can you share with us your thoughts on this area, please? Maybe give me some examples. I know you guys have worked closely together, so please, Nick, chime in. But Georgie, please first.
So I think from the taking of a business into any jurisdiction and expanding, what it is you do, whether it's your goods, services, both, intellectual property is fundamental to that. I would say that's my day job, wearing my IP hat on. But it's the blood life of a business, and it's what differentiates you from your competitors and what keeps what you do secure, safe against someone else doing something that encroaches, on your core business activities. The US takes it really seriously. I find it very refreshing as a jurisdiction to do business because IP is top of the charts when you talk to any professional advisor, whether it's an accountant or a lawyer, and not necessarily an IP lawyer. Even the litigation folks will say, have you got the IP sorted relative to a market expansion? You don't always get that same equivalent experience in the UK. And I think that differentiator is actually quite a typical difference between the US and the UK, in that in the US, business people are used to taking professional advice and want to. It's part of the culture. And it is to a degree in the UK, but not to the extent that it is in the US.
Right.
In the US, typically individuals will not do their own tax returns. It's too complicated. They will go to an accountant here. They will here. Or businesses will go, for example, filing a trademark application. What can be so complicated about that? It's like a company name registration. We'll have a go. It just doesn't happen in the US, partly because it is more complicated there than here.
That's fair.
So it's interesting that the difference in the culture around taking advice relative to, Nick, to what you're saying of the ease of doing business, because it is, but there's a slightly different approach. And certainly when I see US businesses coming to the UK, they've set themselves up early on in taking advice to get that straight. Right. And, they will say to me...
That's a real difference, you see.
I think it is in that pre-planning, because I think they understand how complex their home jurisdiction is, which informs how they take advice. Whereas we don't necessarily have that degree of complexity in the UK around some of the corporate setup and the tax challenges that are multifaceted across the US.
It's always one of the dangers, isn't it? People think sort of trading overseas is going to be similar
it's
to
a mirror
trading
image.
in your own market. And that's sort of, to some extent, something you've got to be absolutely crystal clear about. Yeah. It's going to be different.
It is. And actually, from an IP perspective, the rights that are protected in the US and in the UK are fairly similar. The processes to getting registered protection are relatively similar. Trademarks are more complicated and costly in the US compared to the UK, but they're relatively similar. And I say that because there's then stark contrast with other areas of law. And I'd say employment labour law
always comes up, doesn't
absolutely at the top. And I'd say it's probably the area where US businesses coming into the UK have the greatest surprise and will be like, say, what do you mean I can't have a, contract at will and termination at will? And the labour laws that we have enshrined in our legislation and the protection to employees are, wildly different to the US. But then again, the comparison in the US, say for a UK entity expanding over there and relatable to a client we've been helping is, for example, they have workers in California.
Right.
In California, the labour laws there are particularly stringent when compared with other states in the US. And as an example, if you have a particularly skilled worker in the IT sector, they're entitled to higher remuneration than the worker who is not so skilled. Yeah. And it so happens for this client, they have very highly skilled workers in the IT sector. And therefore, that type of legislation comes as a surprise. And again, goes back to the question of, and actually they do need to be in California. That's the absolute right place for their business. But if a client had that unintended consequence of walking into California when they don't need that type of person there, and they could have easily set up in where it is, Texas, the Carolinas, it has a real consequence in terms of the operation of their business.
So would you say that the coordination of the advice a company is getting from its accountants and its lawyers on both sides of the Atlantic is key to this?
Yeah, it needs to be holistic.
Right.
And where you have got advisors who understand those nuances in different states. And it goes back to the question of why.
Yeah.
Why do you need to be there? Why do your workforce need to be there? Or can they be elsewhere? And how would you manage that? And having, not professing to be a specialist at all in US laws, but through, hand-holding clients in those jurisdictions, we get to understand through the different states what the complexities and the differences are. And then, of course, we would link, our clients, our contacts with those appropriate connections, but it's being able to signpost those issues at an early stage before it goes slightly down too far a line.
You're driving the conversation to some extent, aren't you? If you've got a client that says to you, look, I'd like to expand into the US, the fact that you're well versed, having been down the path before, supporting companies, some of the pitfalls that are sitting there, the questions to ask. Yes, it is a collaborative endeavour to piece together the UK with the US, but somebody is sort of needing to help sort of drive that conversation, ask the right questions, make sure that the right people are coming in to provide that advice at the right time. I mean, going back to your point on intellectual property, it's typically the most valuable asset, but people, to some extent, might not even think about it. They've got this IP that they've built up in their home jurisdiction. They're looking to exploit it in that overseas market, and they need to think about, you look at it more from the protection point of view, clearly. We're looking at it from the actual interaction. How is that IP being used between those markets? Would you, if you set up in that market, do you need to charge for the use of that IP? Typically, you should be. You should be putting in place that good documentation between the UK and the US company to actually determine who has the ownership and who has the right to charge and use it at what cost, etc. And that, Richard, goes back to the point I was talking about, the business model. People need to think through that business model. What is being held by one company being used by another company and should be sort of charged for it. Technically it's your transfer pricing, but actually it's really just understanding that interaction between the two markets.
Yeah, I see.
I mean, I've seen numerous examples where a client's wanted to, expand in any jurisdiction, but using the US as an example, and particularly in relation to consumer products, I'm talking about here, but realise they don't have the IP locked down in the US. They don't have the trademarks. And actually, in two really big corporate acquisition cases, someone else had the mark and was a blocker to them.
Grief.
And was a barrier to the transaction proceeding.
Wow.
Because the question then was, from the financiers, okay, let's see what the IP looks like. Where's your schedule of your trademarks? Oh, what's going on in the US? And then, we'll have a look, we'll file an application, only to realise
too late.
It's too late.
Yeah.
That can come up in many different ways. I mean, even if you're in a parent-subsidiary relationship where you think, well, actually, it's all under one roof, if to some extent your IP is morphing and what you're doing in the overseas jurisdictions is sort of building on top of that IP, if somebody came along to buy that subsidiary, what are they buying? Who's owning the IP? That will constantly be a challenge that would come up through due diligence. If you haven't locked down the ownership of the IP, you haven't defined who's doing what for who, if it's all just treated as one across your group, then you are likely to have issues down the line.
We've established this is a vast country, 50 states, hugely different cultural qualities at times. Georgie, could you talk us through some examples of when you go to the US, how business is done differently across these states? Maybe touch on the 8 memorandums of understanding that have been put in place to date.
9 as of yesterday, Colorado.
Bang, great.
Yeah, it's similar, but to a much greater extent compared to the UK. Doing business in London compared to Leeds or Manchester feels different culturally. But it's the same sort of business. That's the difference in the US. It's governed by, different state laws and practices. So you've got that added complexity there. I think you feel the difference. Yeah. And you'll feel that, as a traveller, indeed, as much as you would a business person. And the difference between Boston, New York, compared to Miami, moving into Texas, Utah, is all a very different feel. What I think is interesting is some of the commonalities in terms of the flow of business between the US and the UK, and where we're seeing the statistics. And when you were talking about the FDI, Richard, actually how similar that is between the US and the UK. Say, for example, crude oil. It's our number one import from the US. They don't have that from us, unsurprisingly. But what they do have in terms of that almost quite equal flow of import-export between the two countries. Professional services, healthcare. Actually, the UK exports more in medicine and pharmaceuticals to the US than we import from the US.
It does, yeah.
Surprise to many.
Yeah.
Financial services, IP.
Yeah.
They are all kind of top of the charts and fairly equal relatively to each country's, GDP, but on a par with each other. And it's interesting then how that feeds through to the sort of industry play. So what's becoming interesting, certainly in terms of the strength of the UK and our industries,
right,
are the creative industries. And these are things which are signposted, in government policy and what we're concentrating on: creative industry, AI and technology, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, green tech. And I know you've mentioned the MOUs. Those MOUs, pretty much all of them have highlights around industries and sectors. And all of those feature pretty much, apart from green tech, I think, for Florida, but they're all weaved in those MOUs in terms of the critical industries. Actually, one of the other ones to mention is the airline industry and aircraft, which is particular to certain states that have signed up those MOUs, and UK localities too. But it's interesting to see that pattern in terms of those sectors and the interplay and how it marries up between both countries. It's not, say for, crude oil, there's a real commonality between the US and the UK, which I think creates further opportunities. It's not like other jurisdictions where it's, say, just manufacturing is the main player, or, I don't know, it's technology, whatever. It's multi-sectoral, and it really plays to what, the UK strengths are in terms of its leading industries.
Yeah, interesting.
And where we're seen as a global leader, I mean, particularly in technology, healthcare, AI, the UK is seen as an absolute forefront runner in those industries.
Yeah. Nick, any observations there?
I mean, one of the things I was going to say is that people hear a lot about Delaware.
Yeah.
And we're touching on states. So, it's fair to comment on it, I think, because, a lot of UK businesses expanding into the US will probably hear that Delaware is the place to go. And that is only from a legal position.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not a tax-related matter. It's a legal difference because you incorporate within one of the states in the US. So you could incorporate it within any of the states. Delaware tends to come to the surface because it's got a well-established body of case law, which companies can rely on. So they like to establish there. So a lot of the larger companies certainly are there. A lot of US lawyers are kind of versed in Delaware law as well as probably their
And they have judges and courts that are specialist in that kind of company affairs that they don't in other states.
So you say, why do you go to Delaware? It tends to be through the incorporation.
Yes.
But then you've got to say, where am I actually doing business?
Where am I physically put my flag in the ground?
Absolutely.
Right?
So you incorporate in Delaware, but you typically do business in other states. Where have you got your people, your equipment, your offices, etc.? You'll need to also register in those states to do business. Sometimes you find that if it's a very simple operation, you might incorporate and register in exactly the same state. We've certainly seen that being advised, but wherever you've got people, that particular state is going to want its share of the tax pie. I don't envy US advisors that are dealing with the state and local taxes. It's a minefield in terms of operating or determining how the taxes arise between these different states. One thing to mention, certainly from a UK perspective, is that if you're selling goods into the US, even if you are not attached in any other way, you may not have got people out there, etc., you can still be drawn into the US tax system.
Yes.
The state and local taxes have got certain thresholds in terms of what they would call sort of economic attachment factors. And if you're economically attached because you're selling, a volume of goods over and above their thresholds, then you still need to register and pay local taxes in that particular state. So although you might not be there, you can certainly be drawn into the US tax system. So we certainly would say to anybody that's looking to do business in the US, yes, there's different places you might go from a different sort of sector point of view, but ultimately, before you go, really work out how you're going to be doing business
Yeah.
out there, where you're going to need to have your people and equipment. Often, actually, I find people choose where to go, firstly, if they find the talent. That's not always easy, so that can be an indicator. A lot of US businesses that I know do sort of operate, relatively remotely with some of their staff. So you could well find that you've got staff in any of the different states, depending on where you find the talent. And as we said before, there's a big difference between doing business on the East Coast and the West Coast. So that is often one of the first challenges for people.
So at a high level summary, both countries have regional strengths across various sectors. And you've got to think very carefully as well as to where you're going to set yourself up as to where you physically need talent. Juxtaposed to the tax consideration that will always come into play. But get your advisors on board early to talk through what your options are, what the challenges might be, so that you have a plan that you can put in place.
You probably do it, and we certainly do. We have lots of what we would call introductory calls.
Where we're a concierge service, Nick.
Absolutely. You're doing that first stage sort of awareness, upscaling a business's knowledge as to what that environment is going to look like from their perspective. There are all these differences. One of the things which is often a key difference is that going into the US, you don't necessarily publish your accounts on financial company's house like you do in the UK, and that actually comes as a bit of a shock to US businesses coming into the UK, that suddenly that privacy they've enjoyed in their home state, they're now having to put their financial statements on public record here. When you go the other way,
particularly if they're a Delaware incorporated company.
Because they're not.
They don't show the ultimate beneficial owners.
Absolutely, and that actually drives out quite a significant point, which perhaps people need to. It's a bit technical, but actually, all this know your client information that we need in order to advise people, that client due diligence, certainly if you've got complex structures, can take quite a lot of time to work through, and it doesn't seem to sort of have such a requirement in the US.
No, it doesn't, and it's partly because of our proceeds of crime legislation, but it feeds through to engaging professional advisors in the UK, particularly accountants and lawyers who are subject to certain regulations around KYC, but also, getting a bank account.
But you've probably found that somebody wants immediate advice, and unfortunately, as a professional, you can't. Because you need to actually work through someone's structure and obtain evidence of ownership, etc. And that takes time. So, going back to some of our earlier points, actually being aware of how to navigate a new country and getting everything lined up in advance so that you don't hit the buffers at some point is clearly, a well-versed business who's done it before will know that that's what they need to do.
Grand. Any final thoughts before I wrap up? Been really interesting.
I mean, from my point of view, the US is the big one as a single market. Hopefully we haven't painted it as a market which is so complicated to navigate that you scare people off, because it certainly isn't. It certainly is a very attractive market. There is an ease of doing business there. But as we've said a few times, it's very different to the UK. You can't get over that. And therefore, businesses just need to get that upfront advice so that they go in with their eyes open, they know what to expect. And then I think we've seen so many businesses be super successful in the US that I think it should be on, any company that has the capability to expand into the US, because of the size of that market, I think it can significantly fuel their growth.
Yeah, I think the opportunity is immense. And because it is so vast, whereas, a UK, what's been a UK-focused business may feel it's congested or it's reached its sort of key point here. The opportunities there, as I say, are immense. But I think it all goes back to the why, and why is it you're looking at a particular place. And I just add, in addition to the kind of the legal regulatory environment, is thinking where you might situate yourself in the US relative to corporate setup, legal regulatory environment, but also I think is business support.
Right.
So again, thinking about that sector you're in, what support is there around there? And there's lots of different things which weigh into, your easy passage into
You're talking about,
the US.
the ecosystem
The
around
business
a business.
ecosystem.
Yeah.
So whether that is the consulate office, the embassy, a Department of Business and Trade, business networks, how does that help fuel your business, settle you in, bring you into a community, which helps, particularly if you've moved your family as well, which often many of our clients will do. They'll be taking, their kids, they'll be going to school there. That builds you in a community, but also your business. And again, that experience is different across many states in terms of what might be on offer. For example, the DBT will do trade missions with certain sectors, groups, which gives businesses an idea of what it might be like to do business, to set up in a particular locality. And, they put on those roadshows, for example, in the UK, and they're great opportunities to get a bit of an insight into what is going on in a particular area in the US and what might be available to you.
It's interesting. The Department for Business and Trade, I think, is a really potent resource, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, there are trade advisors dotted all around the world in the main parts of the world that the UK does trade in, and obviously the US no less so. And these guys, their sole reason for being is to help, if they're based in, say, Houston, to help you to actually do business in Houston, whether you're exporting to Houston or whether you're a company that's based in Houston looking to come to the UK. And certainly we got some great connections there within Irwin Mitchell to plug people in there. But that's excellent. So the summary would be that we have a trading relationship with the US, both outward and inward, which is really envious. There's no reason to believe that businesses aren't going to wish to continue to grow on that. But, you need to be mindful that it comes with its challenges, like anything that's good in life. It isn't easy. But there is professional help at hand to help companies to navigate their way through, to make successful sales out into the US marketplace, and to gain successful investment into the UK for US indigenous companies. Fair?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I think, that's always going to figure on someone's radar, isn't it? The US, as we've said, there's a lot of meaningful conversations you can have up front in order to really understand what that might look like for your business. Well, sort of prepared businesses will do that research up front, and then, take advantage of what that market has to offer.
Right. Fantastic. Thanks very much to both of you. That's given some real food for thought for anyone looking for their next opportunity or partnership, and brings this season to a close nicely. As always, to you, our listeners, thank you once again for tuning in. That's all from this season, but we'll be back in a little while with new stories and guests to help you do business, but better. Make sure you hit the subscribe button to be the first to know about this new series. But bye for now, and thank you.